Hello, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Jenny, and I have something a little bit different for you today, because today I thought we might talk about math. I don't mean for that to be intimidating at all. I think that sometimes when we talk about sweater math, even just calling it sweater math makes it sound more involved and complicated than it really has to be. So I have been knitting on the Polina pullover by Teddy Lutzak, and as I came to talk to you about this a couple of weeks ago, it made me realize that even though I never knit on gauge, I knit off gauge deliberately and methodically all the time. I don't often talk about it because I am a little bit embarrassed about the fact that I do it. And the harder I look at that, the more, like most things, I think that it's actually not worth being embarrassed about. It's something that I do because it gives me garments and knitting processes and fabrics that I'm happy with, and I'm going to keep doing it. So I thought that actually I would share that with you and stop being embarrassed about it. I've decided to approach this video in a slightly different way than my other videos, however, because if I'm honest, I have filmed this more than once, and the educator in me was really not happy. Because I think that I was treading too much of a middle ground and not providing enough detail for anyone who might be interested in this kind of thing but intimidated, who hasn't tried this kind of thing before. At the same time, I was giving too much detail for people who might already do this kind of thing all the time and just be interested to see if the way that I do it differs from the way that they do it. So what I've chosen to do in this case, how I'm going to organize this now, is to divide this video up into distinct sections and make a playlist. So it will actually be several separate videos. My hope with that is that it will make it less intimidating to click on a huge, hour and 20-minute long video that you would then navigate through with timestamps. I think sometimes just clicking on a long video can be overwhelming when we're really hoping to just learn something or just check in on something. So it's different videos for that reason. But I'm also hoping that it will make it really easy to jump around and really select what parts are going to be interesting and are useful for you and what parts are not. So I hope that this is useful. I will link to all the parts of this series, I guess, in the description box of each video, and I will also put an info card at the beginning of each video to this introduction in case any context would be helpful at any point. So hopefully that will make it accessible and easy to navigate. And I'll be interested to know if you think that this is effective, or is this overwhelming in a different direction? I hope not. So now in this introduction, I'm really just going to give you a few rapid fire caveats and notes for how I'm going to approach this, just to give you a bit of context and an idea of what to expect. And then I'm going to give you a full roadmap and describe each video and just give you kind of like the most rapid fire bullet point about what that video will cover. Before I jump into any of that, just to say that I know that many of you knit off gauge already and probably have different ways of approaching some of this. An ice cream truck just went by and I'm a bit distracted. It's too cold for ice cream, but gosh, it would be nice. I know that some of you will approach this in different ways, and if you have any ways of doing any of this that you think are more effective or more efficient or easier than the way that I'm presenting it, please do share. I'm always keen to learn. I'm certainly not presenting these videos as the best way to do any of this, so I'm always keen to learn other people's tips. I like being a student. Please share. And I think that would hopefully be helpful for others as well. And that leads us very nicely into the first caveat, which is that I am not a professional tech editor or designer by any means. This is not a tutorial. If we need to call it anything, I think that I would be comfortable calling this knitting advice from a knitting friend, or advice from a fallible knitting friend, shall we say. I do hope that this will be helpful, but every time you knit off gauge, it's going to be a little bit different because every garment, every pattern brings its own particular factors and challenges. So I think that it would be kind of impossible to say that I'm an expert at this because I just haven't done every kind of pattern out there. So definitely not an expert, really just hoping to get you started and maybe give you some tools if this is something you're interested in. The second caveat along these lines is that knitting off gauge is breaking the rules. Once you've bought a pattern, you do whatever you want to do with that pattern. I am a very strong believer that we should break the rules in whatever way we want to break the rules with knitting. The stakes are pretty low, you know, at worst you're going to do some frogging. So go ahead and break those rules. But I bring up that this is breaking the rules because I do think that it's important to note that even though a pattern you're working on off gauge is still a designer's design, it's still their intellectual property, their IP, as soon as you knit off gauge, as soon as I knit off gauge, we're really throwing the designer's math and all of the work that they did to grade that pattern out the window. And every interaction that I've had on YouTube has been kind of absurdly positive. I really don't feel like this is necessary to say, but just because it is the internet, and I know that knitting can be emotional, you know, especially if it's late in the evening and we realize that we've made a big mistake, we can feel really frustrated. So just to note that if we are knitting off gauge, we are doing it with agency, and we really shouldn't be turning around to designers and complaining to them or pestering them or asking them for help with any problems that we run into when we're knitting off gauge, because they've already done their work and their math and we've chosen to ignore it. So just to make a note of that. A few quick notes about my approach to this video. The first and most important is that because I am looking at all of this through the lens of my Polina pullover test case, I guess we'll call it, I am talking in particular about top-down yoked constructions and constructions with colorwork. The basic math, the basic formula that we're looking at will actually apply to any garment or any construction where you want to knit off gauge, but you will need to be taking other factors and other decisions and other challenges into account in other cases, right? This is true also of other yoked constructions, because anytime a pattern has extra details like colorwork or textured knitting or anything unusual about its construction or design, again, other factors are going to come into account and you're going to have to make certain other observations and prepare yourself for accommodating those. So just to note that this is not one size fits all. The math is the same, so you know, I think you can, hopefully this is enough, these are enough tools that you can figure things out, but I think that we should expect challenges, and certainly every time I knit a garment off gauge, even though that's kind of all I do, I learn something slightly different each time. The Polina pullover for me has actually been a really interesting example of that, because there is colorwork both on the yoke before you split for sleeves and on the body after you split for sleeves. So I'm hoping that this will be a useful example for exactly how that works, exactly how different specific patterns might present issues that you hadn't encountered before or might need to think of kind of on the spot. Two more quick notes. I will be using millimeters for all of the needle dimensions throughout these videos. The reason for that is really just that I am most comfortable with millimeter needles, and I think the least duplicate information that I can throw at you, the better, just in terms of keeping things streamlined and accessible. Along the same lines, I am only going to use inches when I talk about dimensions throughout these videos. I am actually more comfortable with the metric system in almost every other element of my life except for talking about body dimensions and garments. Just in that way that some of us who live in metric countries, you know, are still kind of on the cusp of that switch over. I learned to sew as a child and talk about body dimensions from my mom, who still uses inches for that kind of thing. If you live in a country that is more thoroughly metric, or my experience does not apply to you and you just are more comfortable with metric, I think it is important to note that you can just substitute in your metric units for the inches in any equation that we're looking at, in any case that we're looking at. If that is the kind of thing that stumps you a little bit or makes any of this math feel overwhelming, or you're just not exactly sure how to do that or what measurements you're looking for in centimeters, they are the same, but if that feels overwhelming to you, then please do just drop me a comment. I've chosen to go with just inches in order to streamline things and keep the number of numbers that I'm throwing at you to a minimum, but I am very happy to write any of this up in centimeters for you, so that would not be an imposition. Please do just let me know. And where are we headed? So here's the kind of complete roadmap of the different videos that will be linked below and in the playlist for you. So this is the introduction. I'm not going to number it. This will just be a reference kind of to get you started and hopefully helpful for anyone who might stumble on any of the other parts of the videos without context and need a bit of help. Part 1 is going to be why knit off gauge. Why I knit off gauge, why you might knit off gauge. In this video, I'm going to talk in particular about knitting off gauge to find a fabric that you like, to find a fit that you like, so changing the dimensions of a garment, for example, and to just generally make a pattern work more for you. I will also talk a little bit about yarn construction and the different factors that go into making 1 DK weight yarn knit up quite differently and feel very different from another DK weight yarn that might be knit up at the same gauge. So that will just be a kind of general overview to the questions and factors that make it so that I do never knit off gauge. I am a strong believer in substituting yarn, and for me that often means that I'm going to want to play with the density of the fabric. Part 2, I'm going to use my Polina pullover as a test case and talk to you about what made me realize I wanted to knit this off gauge and what size I decided to knit this in because I realized that I was going to be off gauge. I will then pair this with kind of a general overview of the procedure that I take for any pattern, any garment. Once I've decided to knit off gauge, what do I do next? How do I figure out how much yarn I should buy? Because as soon as you are knitting off gauge, you are going to be changing the yarn requirements for that project. And then, what math do you do, and when do you know that you've arrived at a combination of fabric and finished garment dimensions that you're going to be happy with? Part 3 is going to be the math itself. This is where I will present to you the main formula, which is really just a comparison of ratios that you're going to be using to do all of the math that you're going to need to do. I will also show you in that video where you can source the numbers for this math. Because in an ideal world, you would already have the pattern and you would be able to go and find, for example, the number of stitches at the bust so that you can figure out that dimension, and the number of stitches at the upper arm so that you can figure out that dimension. But sometimes it happens that we have a yarn and a fabric that we're interested in knitting, but we don't actually own the pattern yet, right? So maybe you've already gone through your general procedure, you know what gauge you want to knit at, but you want to see if it will work for a given pattern before you actually purchase the pattern. It is absolutely possible to figure that out and to reverse engineer some of those stitch counts from the dimensions that a designer gives us. And the more the information they give us before we buy the pattern, the better, right? So if they give you a full schematic, as is the case with Teddy Litzak, then you can do quite a bit of math and figure out a lot of detail about fit off gauge even before you have to buy that pattern. So I'll talk about that in that section as well. Part 4, I'm going to come back to my Polina pullover as a test case again and put the math in practice. So this is where we'll do a couple of examples of these formulas so that you can see them in action and really just see what those numbers do when you plug them in and what results that gives you. I did quite a bit more swatching for the Polina pullover than usual, so I'll show you, if you start off really having no idea what kind of gauge you're going to be happy with, hopefully this part of the video will be helpful for you in that regard. Because I did a lot more swatching than usual for this case, so I think it's a helpful example, I hope. Part 5, and the final part of the video, is going to be where I am with my Polina pullover now. You might not be able to see in the screen, in fact I don't think it's visible in the screen, but I have actually restarted my Polina pullover since I spoke with you last. I haven't changed the gauge that I'm knitting it at, but I ran into an issue with row gauge that I had not anticipated because it has not been an issue for me in previous patterns where I've knit off gauge in a similar way. So again, I'm hoping that this will be a really helpful example, and in this section I'll show you how I used that same formula, the same formula I'm presenting to you everywhere else, to resolve that issue, and I think it's really fixed it. I'm happy with the result. So a good example of just, unforeseen things cropping up in a slightly different construction, a slightly more complicated color work motif that is both above and below the split for sleeves, but also hopefully an example of how that doesn't have to be too intimidating. In this case, it does involve some frogging for me, but not too much time lost, and I'm going to be really happy with the finished result. So that is where this is all headed. I do hope that it will be useful for you. Again, please feel free to navigate these videos in the way that is going to make the most sense for your brain and be the most useful for you in terms of what you're going to find helpful and what you're not going to find helpful. If you have any questions, please do leave them below. And again, if you have any ideas or suggestions, I'm open to those as well. I always like to learn. So thank you as always for joining me, and here we go.